Marine veteran and his dog are denied entry on airplane, then Barron Trump intervenes. Imagine this: a decorated Marine veteran who has sacrificed years of his life for his country, alongside his loyal service dog, at the airport preparing to board a plane home after an exhausting mission. They've been through so much together, battling not only the dangers of war, but the emotional scars that follow. But instead of a warm welcome home, they face an unbelievable situation, a heartbreaking denial of entry. Despite their service and sacrifices, this Marine and his dog are told they cannot board the flight. This isn't a story of just one man's struggle. It's a story that speaks to something much larger, something that has the power to stir emotions in anyone who hears it. How is it possible that someone who has given so much for their country can be turned away at the most vulnerable moment? The veteran, standing in the airport with his dog by his side, is faced with confusion and frustration. His service dog, a companion he trusts with his life, is suddenly the reason they can't board the flight. The airline has rules, and those rules are standing in their way, no matter the reason. The dog, trained to assist the veteran in his daily life, is suddenly the obstacle. But as tensions rise and frustration begins to boil over, a surprising figure steps forward. Someone with a unique position and voice. Someone who, at first glance, might not seem like an obvious ally. It's none other than Barron Trump, son of former President Donald Trump, stepping into the fray. As he witnesses the unfair treatment unfolding before him, something inside him shifts. A young man who, like everyone else in that airport, could have simply minded his own business, yet he chooses to intervene. What happens next is nothing short of extraordinary. The situation, which seemed like an insurmountable wall for the Marine veteran, begins to shift as Barron steps up, using his voice and influence to bring about a change. But how far will he go? Will his intervention be enough to change the fate of the veteran and his dog? What happens when a young man with connections uses his position to stand up for what's right, despite the odds? And that's where the story takes a twist. Because despite the hopes of the Marine and his dog, despite Barron Trump's efforts, the situation is far from over. There are unseen forces at play, and the true outcome is still in question. Will this young man's act of kindness be enough to break through the red tape? Or will the veteran and his dog be left stranded, powerless against the systems that seem determined to keep them apart? In the next part of the story, we'll uncover the unexpected turns that follow. And just when you think it couldn't get any more intense, something else happens, something that no one could have predicted. Stay with us as we explore this incredible story of determination, compassion, and the unexpected heroism that can emerge when you least expect it. The tension in the airport was palpable as the Marine veteran stood at the counter, his face a mixture of confusion and disbelief. His dog, a German shepherd named Max, sat patiently by his side, sensing the unease but remaining calm. Max wasn't just any dog. He had been by the Marine's side for years, through the hardest moments of his life, helping him navigate the chaos of PTSD. The bond they shared went beyond words, and Max had become not just a companion but a lifeline, his presence a constant source of comfort in an often tumultuous world. But now, that very bond was being questioned. The airline's representative, a stern woman with little empathy in her eyes, was explaining the policy. No, dogs were not allowed on the flight unless they were registered as service animals, and according to her records, Max wasn't on the list. The Marine tried to explain that Max was indeed his service dog, but the rules were clear, no exceptions. The veteran, a man who had faced down enemy forces without hesitation, suddenly found himself helpless. He couldn't understand how something as simple as getting on a flight had become so complicated. He had flown with Max countless times before. This wasn't the first time they had traveled together, but today, it felt like the universe had conspired to remind him of all the things he couldn't control. The emotions, the exhaustion, the uncertainty of life after service, all of it was creeping up on him in that moment. Around them, the bustle of the airport continued, but to the veteran, it all felt like a blur. He wasn't used to asking for help. He had been taught to handle things on his own, to deal with the struggles that came with his service. But standing there, with Max at his side, he realized he couldn't do it alone anymore. He needed someone to understand, someone to see beyond the rules and recognize the human element at play. That's when Barron Trump, who had been sitting nearby, overheard the conversation. He had been at the airport for a private flight, traveling back from a business meeting. The young man had been keeping a low profile, but something about the situation caught his attention. Barron wasn't someone who usually got involved in other people's problems. He had enough of his own challenges to deal with, but as he saw the Marine veteran, standing tall yet visibly shaking with frustration, something stirred within him. He thought about his own family, about the way his father had often talked about the sacrifices made by those who served their country. He thought about the stories of veterans who came back from war only to face another battle back home, a battle against the systems that didn't seem to understand their struggles. Without thinking, Barron stood up and walked over. He didn't know what he could do, but he knew he had to try. He introduced himself to the Marine, offering a handshake that felt oddly significant in that moment. There was something about the man's demeanor, his exhaustion, his humility, that moved Barron in a way he hadn't expected. He quickly learned the situation. The veteran explained how Max was his service dog, how they had been through so much together, how they had both fought battles that no one else could understand. And Barron, for the first time in a long while, felt a deep sense of responsibility to help. He turned to the airline employee, who was still unmoved by the veteran's plea. Barron, using his voice and influence, calmly explained the situation, emphasizing that the veteran's service dog was essential to his well-being. He spoke with a quiet intensity, a young man with the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He knew the rules, but he also knew that some rules didn't take into account the full picture. The look on the employee's face remained unchanged. She reiterated that without the proper documentation, the dog couldn't board. Barron's heart sank as he realized that despite his best efforts, the situation was not getting better. The veteran's face showed a mix of disbelief and growing despair. Max, sensing his owner's distress, let out a soft whine, looking up at the Marine as if to say, "I'm here with you. I won't leave you." The situation seemed to be spiraling, and Barron could feel the anger rising in him. He wasn't the type to make a scene, but there was something so deeply unfair about what was happening. It was as if all the sacrifices this Marine had made, his service, his loyalty, his life, had been boiled down to a single rule that ignored the humanity of it all. And that wasn't right. As Barron stood there, torn between wanting to make a scene and knowing that would only make things worse, he realized that time was running out. The flight was about to board, and the veteran and his dog were still stuck at the counter, waiting for a solution that didn't seem to be coming. Barron felt the weight of the moment. He wasn't just standing up for this Marine. He was standing up for something much bigger, a system that had too often failed those who had given everything for their country. The veteran, his dog, and Barron, caught in this strange intersection of rules and human compassion, were now faced with a choice. Barron had to decide if he was going to walk away or if he was willing to use everything at his disposal to make things right. Just as the tension reached its peak, a voice interrupted the standoff. Someone from the airline approached, someone with authority, but no one was prepared for what happened next. The voice, calm but firm, asked for the veteran's paperwork one more time. But this time, there was something different in the air, something that suggested a resolution might finally be on the horizon. Would Barron's influence be enough to sway the situation in the veteran's favor? Would the Marine and his loyal service dog finally be allowed to board the plane and return home? Or was there more to this story than anyone realized? As the next moments unfolded, the outcome was still hanging in the balance, with everyone watching, hoping for a miracle that seemed increasingly out of reach. Just as the tension seemed to reach its peak, a different figure stepped forward, a man in a sharp suit, his expression calm but resolute. He didn't look like the typical airline employee. He carried an air of authority, as if he had the power to settle disputes on a much larger scale. Barron Trump, who had been bracing for a confrontation, turned toward him, his heart pounding. The man introduced himself as a senior officer from the airline, someone who had the power to make exceptions when necessary. The officer turned to the Marine, offering a polite but firm handshake, There was something about his demeanor, something that hinted at understanding, at empathy. Barron watched closely, his eyes shifting from the officer to the Marine and back again. The officer asked the veteran to explain his situation once more, carefully listening to every word. As the veteran spoke, his voice steady despite the weight of the moment, Barron couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, things could turn around. But then, the officer dropped the bombshell. He acknowledged that while the airline's policy was strict, there had been a misunderstanding. It turned out that Max's paperwork had been misplaced during a routine check. The officer admitted it was a mistake on the airline's part, one that had gone unnoticed until now. The paperwork was, in fact, in order. It was a simple error that had caused the whole debacle. Max was indeed a registered service dog, and there was no reason why the veteran and his loyal companion couldn't board the flight. For a moment, it felt like time stopped. The weight that had been pressing down on the Marine's shoulders seemed to lift, replaced with a wave of relief. Max wagged his tail, sensing the shift in energy, and the veteran gave a faint but grateful smile. Barron, standing silently to the side, felt the satisfaction of knowing that his intervention had made a difference, but he also knew there was something deeper here. This wasn't just about one individual or one flight. It was about a larger issue, one that too often goes unnoticed: the way veterans and their service animals are treated, the way their struggles are sometimes dismissed by a system that should be supporting them. The officer, seeing the gratitude in the Marine's eyes, gave a nod of approval and offered them expedited access to the boarding gate. "You and your dog have earned this," he said, his voice surprisingly soft, given the earlier tension. With that, the Marine and Max, along with Barron, walked toward the gate. As they moved through the airport, a quiet understanding seemed to settle between them. Barron had expected a moment of celebration, a moment of triumph. But instead, what he felt was something more profound: a recognition of the challenges that veterans face every day, and the unspoken bond between a soldier and the dog who had been his partner through it all. The world was quick to move on, but Barron knew this moment would stay with him for a long time. They reached the plane, where the final chapter of this unlikely encounter unfolded. The Marine, now seated by the window with Max at his side, looked out at the runway, his mind still processing the whirlwind of events. He didn't know how his life would unfold once he got off this plane. He didn't know what challenges lay ahead, but he knew that, for this one moment, things had worked out. He was going home, and he wasn't alone. Barron, now seated a few rows ahead, glanced back toward the Marine. Their eyes met briefly. Barron nodded, acknowledging the quiet victory they had shared. The veteran smiled back. There was no need for words. Both knew that, in this unpredictable world, sometimes all it took was a little kindness, a willingness to step in when it mattered most. As the plane took off, lifting into the sky, the story of that day began to settle into its rightful place in their lives. The chaos, the tension, the frustration, they all faded into the distance, replaced with something far more significant: a reminder that the battle for fairness, for respect, and for kindness was never really over. It wasn't about the rules or the policies. It was about the people who lived by them, and the moments when one person's intervention could make a world of difference. And maybe, just maybe, that small act of compassion could help shift the system, just a little bit, for the better. As the plane soared through the clouds, Barron couldn't help but reflect on the bigger picture. The world wasn't perfect, far from it. But there were moments, small, quiet moments, when people chose to do the right thing. And in those moments, anything was possible.